everyone, and welcome to this week's episode of Leap. Welcome. Thank you all for taking the time and tuning in and listening to what I hope will be another rich conversation. And that those of you who are either in the grieving process or maybe supporting people, that you will take a nugget or two that will help you on your own journey. Today, I have a special guest with me and a fellow writer. I'm just going to do a brief bio of you, Anne, and then just talk a little bit about your brother, and then we'll dive right into your story. So today I have Anne Pinkerton with me. She is an essayist, a memoirist, and a poet. Her work often circles around grief and loss, as well as coping with painful realities in our lives. Her memoir, Were You Close? A Sister's Quest to Know the Brother She Lost, is forthcoming from Vine Leaves Press this month on the 11th. And this show might even air after the 11th. So you will all be able to go and get her book. We'll have all of the links in the show notes for you. When I was writing my book, Anne and I had an opportunity to connect, and I knew that she was also in the midst of writing her memoir about her brother. And as I was reading her memoir, it touched me deeply because we had some similar experiences. But I want to just introduce her brother because he touched my heart in her memoir. And so I did a deep dive and read a whole bunch of different things about David. So David Boyd is Anne's brother, who she lost to a climbing accident on September 3rd in 2008. He was on Little Bear Mountain in Colorado, and he was an extreme athlete. And I'm just going to read some quotes that I read about your brother. He was a physician, and he was one of the brightest and most skilled radiologists to ever practice in the Northwest Houston area. David was brilliant, humble, thoughtful, and caring. He touched thousands of lives in his medical practice and was loved equally by his patients, colleagues, and hospital staff. He was a pillar of strength for his group and all of their hospitals. And a quote, "We will never get over his loss. We will never forget him," said one of his partners, Eric Hardy, who was also a doctor. And just another small excerpt. I pulled so many different things when I was reading about him. David was everyone's favorite, a cherished friend, and the best teammate. He leaves a great void in his loving community of colleagues, friends, and family. He was known for his great abilities, his humility, and his love of the outdoors. Some comments from his fellow racers show the depth of his generous spirit. Dave Boyd was a Houston-based doctor, a triathlete, adventure racer, mountain biker, hiker, mountaineer, and otherwise an outdoor junkie whose authentic or athletic endeavors were surpassed only by his character and humility. And he was a world-class athlete, and more importantly, a world-class human being. I could go on and on. I will stop there. But I think that what struck me, I had this vision of who he was. And of course, he was physically gorgeous too. He's just beautiful. But just his spirit of these extreme athletes and who they are, and that he died doing what he loved most. And that was very clear in your own search to understand what is this draw to this kind of extreme athleticism, but also how could this have happened to your brother, who was so careful and he was so good at what he did. And I just appreciated your reflections and your quest to understand. So welcome.
Thank you so much, Susan. I'm delighted to be here.
So I don't even know where to start. Why don't you delve into where you would like to start around this story of your brother? It has been 10 years, right?
It's actually been almost
No,
15 now.
I was just sorry, the math, right? I was just
Yeah.
because he was 47 years old when he died, and his birthday was March 13th. He would have been 62, right?
Right, right. And you may be thinking of 10 years because that's the container of the book.
Yes,
Um,
that's what I was. Yeah,
yeah.
when you started from when you finished. Yes. So please tell us about just your story. And I know it's all in your memoir. And I don't, and this isn't to sort of go through page by page your book, but really your journey. And so start wherever you'd like.
Thank you. It was a bit of a messy journey, I guess I could say. When I lost David, of course, my family was just stunned. His teammates were stunned. His radiology practice participants were all just crushed. And I think there is something about sudden death that is especially difficult to get your arms around. And so when I was struggling in the aftermath and feeling like the rest of the world had moved on and was surprised that I wasn't over it, a really dear friend pointed me in the direction of a bereavement writing group. And I touch on this in the book, but that was a really pivotal experience for me in terms of something that really lit the spark of the idea of the book, because I went there in a purely therapeutic kind of mindset. Like, I'm going to hang out with other people who get it, who've been through other losses, who are struggling to find others who really resonate with the experience that you're dealing with. And I found it incredibly soothing to be in the company of others who had experienced a major loss in their lives. And by major, I mean everything from a child to a rabbit. I mean, and nobody got discounted for whatever they were dealing with. But interestingly, it took me until my fourth session with this same bereavement group to encounter anyone else who'd lost a sibling. And so that was part of the experience that also got me really curious about why I felt so kind of out in the cold with my grief. There just weren't a lot of other brothers and sisters talking about it. There was a long span of time where I felt like I must be the only one this ever happened to. It was that isolating. And yet,
I shared that feeling too. You and I both, I think, quoted the same two books that we found on sibling grief and loss.
right,
Yeah.
because they were the only books at the time. And
Right.
there's really not a whole lot more now. But yeah, The Empty Room by Elizabeth DeVita
Yeah.
Rayburn and Surviving the Death of a Sibling by TJ Ray were like literally the only options when I went looking for books. So I was really delighted to find this community of people in this bereavement writing group, which was run by this wonderful woman who was a writer and a former chaplain. And we read very raw pieces to each other that we generated around a table in a library at a retirement community, as one does glamorously when they're working through something. And I just realized that my words were really landing. And I knew it was a very specific group, but I think they encouraged me enough to feel like maybe these words and my story had some traction beyond this little private space, and that maybe others would find some meaning in them. So that was kind of the genesis of considering really sharing this story of losing David with the world. But I was torn about how to approach it, because at first I was just so in awe of him. He really was a larger than life person. And given that there were so many people who were, I mean, he was always a gold star in our family, but learning in the aftermath of his death how much he meant to so many athletes, so many colleagues, so many patients was just stunning. So at first I wanted to write his biography. I thought I'm just going to put him in between the covers. But this whole issue of feeling so alone as a sister kept chewing at me. And I think that, combined with the experience of the bereavement writing group, made me think maybe there's a way to do both, where I could honor him, introduce him to people, let his legacy kind of live on in a way, and also provide some context and hopefully comfort and clarity about what it means to move through grieving a beloved sibling.
Yeah, and I think that you really hit the mark with your book. I think you did both beautifully. And I think that, and my listeners know this. I wrote my MFA dissertation on the healing benefits of writing through grief, loss, and trauma. Ironically, right? That was way before my brother died. And
Wow.
yeah, and then I had to actually test that out with writing my own. And so the healing, I mean, there's so much research behind writing through our own trauma, and many writers have done that. And I think that what struck me with your book, I think, was it was such a beautiful metaphor reading it, because I often think about the grief journey is like climbing a mountain. I think I even say like getting up felt like it was climbing Mount Everest during that grieving process. And I think your journey, it really did feel like you were climbing this mountain and hit that peak, and then you were coming down off the other side. I mean, that's what I envisioned when I was reading your book. And then you had, the little mountain in the background, to separate different elements of the narrative. And it was just, the whole thing was so gorgeously put together when I was thinking about how you were trying to come to terms, not only with your brother's death, but how he died, because of who you knew, because of who he was. Like, you still don't know, right? You will never actually know. I mean, we know he fell, but you don't actually know what happened.
Right. And I think that's another really difficult thing to wrestle with when you try to come to, I don't really believe in this notion of closure, but when you have some kind of resolution or peace about accepting what happened. So, yeah, I mean, I think because he was so accomplished and so planful, and so many people that he had raced with attested to that in the aftermath, it was really, really difficult to get any of our brains around how it was possible that he fell. And because he was alone that time instead of with teammates, it was and is a perplexing mystery that will go on. And it's definitely provided lots of us with a bit of a haunting feeling about what could have gone on. I think that part is hard to let go of. But as I mentioned in a different chapter, I talk about a woman whose brother just was gone, poof, after a camping trip, and his body was never found. And I think that sounds to me like absolute agony, not even knowing where he ended up, whether he's alive or dead, So it could be a lot less resolute. At least after 2 days he was found, and we were able to have our sort of traditional mourning rituals with the memorial service and all that. But yeah, the piece about what actually happened will always nag at us.
And that's where I was going with this, was that your brother's body was found and was able to, you were able to, I know that he was cremated and you had his ashes and you had something of him. And I think that I had a psychologist on here who talked about ambiguous loss, and ambiguous loss is exactly what you're saying. When the body, if people have been kidnapped or they run away or they're just gone, and like you had mentioned in the book, you can't find a body, that you are always left with this, even though probably that the person has passed. When there is no body, I think it is much more difficult to, we use the word closure, and I know what you mean, there is no real closure, but I do think that there is an element when you can see it with your own eyes and you can say goodbye in that way, that there is an element of peace that comes with that knowing, where when you don't have that, there's just always a question mark that's lingering.
Mm-hmm.
Let's talk about your grief journey, because I think that the significance of the title of your book, which I also loved, Were We Close? I think it's one of those questions that people just always ask when you lose somebody in your life. Were you close? And I think it's because they're trying to, we feel so deeply when people that we love are in pain, and maybe they're looking for this element. Oh, if they weren't close, maybe it doesn't sting as much, I mean, I think it's just a psychological thing. And you had, because I would say that our sibling relationships are the most important relationships we can have. And that's true, I think, even if we're estranged from our siblings, because nobody knows us quite like our siblings do. But this question, I feel, is the answer to that is threaded throughout your memoir. And then we get to the end, of course, and I'm not going to go there because I don't want to ruin any surprises. But talk to me about, why did you name the book that? Just kind of give us some context around that and what that meant for you.
Sure. I think it emanated from the experience of, yes, being asked it over and over again, but also being asked a lot of questions that struck me as not really connecting with me exactly. And I kept not knowing exactly how to respond. The particular question, were you close, had me originally saying, like, of course. And then I started thinking about the ways that I didn't know my brother, that I go into in the book, the ways I didn't know him as deeply as I thought I did, or as much as I wanted to. And also made me ask both myself and, in a larger context, sort of people asking that question in general, does it matter? What does it mean? What if I say, no, we weren't close? I mean, does that just sort of like let them off the hook in terms of feeling bad for me? Or if I say, yes, we were, then do they feel more tender? And I do think, I'm glad you mentioned estrangement, because I think if people aren't close, especially if it's a familial relation, it provides its own level of complexity about knowing how to navigate the grief kind of journey through, because there was already such a sense of lack of entitlement on my part to be as upset as I was for as long as I was. Like that there was something wrong with me, that I was so devastated by losing David. And I just thought, it feels, when people ask that question, I don't know how to answer it in order to prove to them that I'm entitled to my feelings. And I think so many people that I've talked to really need permission to grieve. They need for people to say to them, there's no one size fits all solution. There's no one size fits all loss. And that's the good news and the bad news. I can't give anybody a playbook for working their way through losing someone they love. But it also means that everybody should be okay with everyone else's path, in terms of taking the time it needs to take, and, going through whatever rituals you need. So it just felt somehow like this question was a very provocative question, and certainly got me going and very curious through the book. And that, you're right, it threads all the way through. But I guess I also thought, if I don't answer this question correctly, I won't get the sympathy I deserve. And that was very hard.
I think that that is very profound. And I would like to sit here for a moment. I have, in my work, I see clients on the side that have lost children to lots of different things. And it is a provocative question. And in running bereavement groups for a long, long time, and dealing with mostly parents, actually, I don't know why, but they're the ones that have come to me that have lost their children, that there is a weird, I just call it weird. I mean, I don't know what else to call it, because I find it so bizarre that when in this culture, when we lose someone, that the world moves on after 2 weeks. You get and especially with a sibling, it's all about, the parents, right? Or if there's a spouse and children involved. Like for me, it was like the only thing I got over and over again is, you've got to be strong for everybody, and I'm like, what happened to me in this scenario? And I think siblings take on a lot, and adult siblings take on a lot, because the parents are falling apart. And then if you got the spouse and the kids, like, that's its own nightmare. But then after 2 weeks, people, they don't do it because they don't love us. They move on because they have a whole life. And I have seen this phenomenon that after it, and it feels like the 4-month mark, and this happened to me, where you just hit this incredible wall, but also that we have this preconceived idea that there is some sort of expiration date on our grief. Like all of a sudden we feel like we can't talk about it. And so we stuff it, we swallow it, we do all the things, or we go see a therapist, or go to a grief group, or go somewhere where we feel like we can be held in the space of our grief and our pain. You went to a writing group, which is fantastic. But I think for people that don't go out and search out help or support, it can be an excruciating, lonely process. And everything that you're saying, do I have the right to feel what I feel? And I say, of course you do. And it takes as long as it takes. Just know if you need help getting through it, because we can get very stuck. And something else too, I am working with a client right now who lost his son, and they were best friends. They did everything together, hiking, fishing, whatnot. And he has ashes. And because this was a very powerful piece for me in your book, was the handling of your brother's ashes, and when you could actually deal with the ashes. And it just reminded me, when he hasn't been able to touch the ashes in 2 years, and he wants to fill this little vial to spread. And I said, can you have your wife do that for you, who is not his son's biological mother? And he said, well, he goes, I was going to ask you if that was okay. And I thought, and I said to him, this is your journey. Why is it that we think we need permission when we're grieving? We don't have a playbook for this. We've got to honor our own path. Can we talk about you, because I feel like there were some poignant moments in this memoir when you were dealing with your brother's ashes, right? Because we think about these bigger than life people. I know that my brother's ashes, I write about that in my own book. I
Mhm.
wanted nothing. I couldn't look at the bag. I couldn't touch the bag. I couldn't deal with it. Can you talk to us? I mean, not to be totally morbid listeners, but I feel like this is something that we deal with.
Oh, I'm here for it, obviously.
Yeah.
I think if we talked about this stuff more, it would just normalize it and it wouldn't be so freaky for
Right.
everybody.
I agree.
I'm all for it. Yeah, I do talk a lot about the ashes because it was a very bizarre experience for me and it was really touching, but it was also super strange. We didn't do the thing that some families do, which is just have a funeral director put them in a pretty urn and put my brother's remains on a shelf or whatever. And that no criticism to anybody who decides to do that because again, everyone's path is valid. But it was pretty crazy that we had no idea what my brother would want, and that's a note to everybody, like please have a will and please make it clear what you'd like. But also because of the racing and travel that he did and the danger and risk that he and his teammates knew they were up against, they did talk about what they would want should they die. And his teammates and friends were very clear that he wanted to be cremated. So that was sort of the first interesting point, was that my mom and my surviving brother and I had no idea, but it was really nice that he had very close confidants who made it clear that that's what he would want done. And then someone had picked up on a conversation where a friend of his had a father who died, and the family and friends had taken parcels of the ashes to places all over the world. And my brother thought that was a very cool idea. So I'm glad he had those conversations at least, so we had some sense of what he might have wanted. And everybody who loved David knew, because of his great wanderlust and sense of exploration and adventure, that it made perfect sense to consider the possibility of splitting up his ashes among friends and family and having him taken all over the world. And he has been taken all over the world now. My mom and David's stepmother and I split up his ashes, and it was a very wild experience, but it was very, very touching that so many people actually wanted to see through this wish that his final resting place was all over the world instead of one spot. So it feels kind of neat. A friend who just read the book said David is everywhere about that, and I thought that was fantastic. I really, really like that idea that he's now sort of everywhere.
I do too. And it's funny because we released my brother's ashes in his favorite beach in Bali, Indonesia. And I think I say that at the very end of my book, that he is everywhere. And and there is, because when they have that bigger than life charisma and who they are, there is something just so beautiful about the idea of that. And they're not contained by their bodies anymore. But I want to talk about the 14ers, because they're all mountains that are 14,000 feet or higher, right? Is that right? 14,000 feet or higher. What are there, 60 something, 52? I can't remember the number, but I know that but hadn't he climbed like 42 of them or something?
Yeah, there may be more 14ers. I'm sure there are
I
many,
don't
many.
know. I know. I'm just.
In Colorado, there are 54, and
Oh,
so
okay. Just Colorado.
yeah, when you think about 14ers in this context, it's about the Colorado 14ers, which are this group of 54, 14,000
14,000.
plus peaks throughout the state. And a lot of, I mean, I had no idea at the time, but a lot of people who are interested in hiking mountains go out to bag them all, to get all 54. It's sort of a rite of passage, not unlike people here on the East Coast like to do the 4,000 footers in New Hampshire. It's another just sort of, and that's crazy in its own right because it's so wintry up there. But at any rate, my brother wanted to get his 54 14ers and bag them all, and he had made it through 40 when he fell, which is pretty wild. It was quite an achievement, but for him, it was just the latest thing. I think, I guess I could look at it like those of us who have writing projects and that we have different, it was our next book or it was our next essay. For them,
Right.
it was just the next quest.
But you filled all of these little vials for, like you said, that he was all over the world. You filled these for people to finish. Am I remembering this right? That they to finish the 14ers in Colorado. Is that right?
Well, specifically, his incredible teammate Sean, who
Sean.
continues to race in the adventure racing team that my brother helped found and was the captain of. Sean agreed to do the rest of the 14ers that David didn't live to conquer. And that was just
It just like brings me to my
incredible.
knees. No, it does. It's so I bawled during the book. I'm crying again now because the friends have to heal too, right? I mean, they just, I'm going to be interviewing my first person who lost their best friend. I haven't had that on the show, but just that honoring, it's so powerful of what David meant to this person, Sean, for him to take this on, to make sure that he finished these 14ers. It was very touching. I was just kind of blown away by it, actually. And as a sister, what that must fill you with, just to know the depth that he touched people in his short life.
Yeah, his teammates are incredible people. I mean, they're incredible athletes, but they're also just lovely and amazing and dedicated to each other in a way that any really close friends are, maybe in a way beyond what a lot of close friends are because they have done all of these kind of life and death things together. I mean, there's something incredibly moving to me about the bond that created among his team, and other friends just who have been in mountain biking races and marathons and things with him. Like there's a real kinship, not only because they're interested in the same things, but because what they're doing is so intense. And yeah, he really had an incredible array of friends, and I'm incredibly honored to call them my friends now. They've been so supportive, and I think
Have
they
they
can.
read your book? Have you sent them your book?
Not yet, not yet. But I'm very excited for them to read it, and I'm very grateful for their contributions, talking to me and helping me understand not only what it was like to be on, say, an adventure racing course, but also to just know what my brother was like when they were out in the middle of nowhere, orienteering and taking on all of these physical feats.
And part of your quest for healing was really trying to understand the mentality of people who engage in these extreme sports. That's another thing that we share in common, because I shared before we started recording that I've watched all the Netflix series on Free Solo and The Alpinist, etc. And because I'm always trying to understand this, it is a thirst for not just adventure. I see it as such a deeply spiritual quest when you are out in the outdoors and you are doing these incredible feats, and you talk about the mental strength the courage and the mental strength and the passion. You have to have so many elements to be able to pull any of these things off. And I know that was also your search for meaning, right? Was really trying to understand, and you immersed yourself. What did you learn through your readings and talking to all of these friends, and what epiphanies or insights did you gain?
Quite a few, actually, I think. Like you, I then became kind of a lifelong fan and just intrigued and curious and proud of people who do that. It didn't start that way. At first, I was really angry that my brother had taken these chances. I mean, it had stolen him from us. And I thought, how could any of that be worth leaving everyone? And, I'm sure that despite discussing his final wishes, it wasn't that he actually thought he was going to die. In fact, I really don't think he did. I don't think people that do it actually think they're going to die. But I do know from my reading of countless issues of Outside Magazine and countless books on every kind of outdoor adventure you can imagine, and talking to people who were climbers, people who did adventure racing, people who just liked to push themselves to the ultimate limit. And from watching those amazing movies that we both love, because it really sets us inside the experience of people who do that kind of thing. Even though you and I will probably always be armchair adventurers, we are very, very curious about what it means to embody that. And so I learned a lot about what drives people and what excites them about getting there. And I think you're really, really right that standing on top of a mountain that you've conquered gives people a spiritual sense of larger than life kind of perspective that you can't achieve a different way. And so some people call athletes like that thrill seekers. I think it's deeper now that I've done all of that research. I don't think people are just looking to get themselves jacked up. I think they're really looking for that kind of clarity or sense of accomplishment, or, I think that it really does important things for people. And I also know that my brother just loved nature, and that didn't surprise me because as kids we spent tons of time outdoors in Texas, crawling in ditches and exploring, woods and all kinds of stuff because we were total nature kids, even though we grew up in a big city. It was every time we could get outside to somewhere beautiful and water ski or look at wild snakes, or I don't know, we did all of that stuff. So growing up, I knew that nature was a real big bond, and certainly one that I still share. But yeah, I was really incredibly impressed once I started to spend time with the stories of these athletes, to know the kind of preparation, the kind of planning, the kind of foresight that goes into successfully having an expedition, and then the incredible satisfaction that comes from achieving those kind of goals. I just think it's probably unlike anything I will ever experience. And I'm pretty blown away by it, to be honest.
Yeah, I feel exactly the same way. And, when you have people who, I call it just that bug that it's in them, it runs through their veins. They have to do it. And it's not even a question. They have to, they must. It's part of the way they, that they express their inner shine, that we all have it and we all express it differently. And we have these different passions, and that's theirs. And so even though the element of risk is always there, what's the alternative? They can't be grounded. You can't clip those wings, right? You just can't clip those wings. And I think that that's what I've grown to understand, is that, yep, this could be my last time, but if I'm going to go out, I'm going to go out doing what I love. And who wouldn't want to die doing what they love?
Truly. I
You
mean, I don't
know?
know what that looks like for writers. Do we fall on our pen? Um, but I do think I totally agree.
Die in the middle of the night typing, like that wouldn't be a
Right?
horrible way to go.
Somehow it's a little bit less dramatic and less exciting. But
Yeah.
but yeah, I mean, you're right. One of the great realizations, and I'm glad you mentioned it, is that I realized there was nothing that would have stopped my brother. That as much as I originally, when he went missing, thought, oh, now he'll cut out all this crazy adventuring stuff. He'll be alive. He'll have a broken leg somewhere. We'll find him and he'll just quit. And but in the deep, back of my mind, I kind of knew that wasn't a thing. And once I did the research, I realized there's no way, because what would living be without your passion?
They would
It's
choose death. They would choose death
absolutely
over not being able to do what lights them up, you know.
100%.
And so, and I think, and again, I mean, I've been gushing over your book because it really touched me on so many different levels. And it's just so beautifully written that you capture so many different emotions and feelings on this grief journey of yours. And I think the other piece, it was sort of this equally important thread, was your relationship with your surviving sibling. Because I think, one thing, and I feel this way as a therapist, but also my own experience, that when a human being dies, we are so engrossed and immersed in our own torture, because that is exactly what it feels like. That I don't think that we talk a lot about the ripple effect in families, and that looks very different for different families based on relationships and dynamics that are happening. But I think with you had two brothers, right?
Yeah.
And you were the only sister. I had four brothers, three surviving, and I'm the only sister. And that was something else that you and I had in common. And so my two younger brothers were BFFs, my two older brothers are BFFs, and I'm like the sis.
Mhm.
And that can feel like an honor. It can feel lonely. It can feel a lot of different things. And I think the other thing that you did beautifully in your book was really capture that relationship with your brother Tommy, and what that navigating that relationship after David died. So can we go there? Can we talk a little bit about your relationship with Tommy?
Yeah, we can. It's a little more complicated because, and going back to the central kind of question here, we've never been as close. And that's not a judgment on either of us, it's just the facts. We just haven't connected on as many points. We haven't, I don't know, we didn't share the same kind of experience. I mean, he was my brother who would sit on my head and fart in my face. So, it's a little bit different than the brother who like made up bedtime stories for me. And, to some extent, they always hazed me because I was the baby and I was the girl. And, they also really loved me. But Tommy and I have, to be perfectly frank, have struggled through the years because I think we really do care about each other and we really wish we had more things in common that we could connect over. And I guess going back to your point about sibling relationships being so meaningful, the thing that no one can ever share with you is the experience of growing up in your family of origin. And the fact that Tommy and I have that is huge. So even if at the end of the day we have that experience and the experience of losing a brother who we both loved beyond reason, it's enough for sure to keep us connected. We do very different things for work. We do very different things for play. We have some different values about living in the world. But when it comes down to, hey, I talked to mom, how's she doing? Da da da. There's nobody else who understands what that experience is like the way that Tommy does. So I am terribly grateful he's still with us on this plane. And he was certainly very supportive of my writing this story about David, because I think, like me, he really wanted to keep David alive in some way and thought this was a cool way. The other thing that I think was profoundly bonding was not just losing David, but feeling so alone in the, after those 2 weeks that you so aptly mentioned, which is really about the amount of focus people have. It's true. You're going to get dedicated care and attention for about 2 weeks, and then people are going to go away. And, we've done it too, even though we've experienced the other end of it. And you're right. It's because everyone's life is really full and everyone has a million things going on, especially these days. But Tommy and I did bond uniquely when I called him and told him I was writing this stuff. And I said, do people ask whether he's married and whether he has kids and how mom is when you're right in front of them? And he burst into tears. And I knew that if nothing else, we saw each other in that moment in a way that no one else had seen us, and that we shared that pain of invisibility.
That is just so beautifully put, because what you and Tommy shared was your deep love for your brother David. I mean, obviously you all loved each other, but your Tommy and David were very, very close, right? They were, I think you said they talked the day before or the day of your brother's death for 45 minutes or whatever. And I think that what I loved about what you wrote is that, we all have different relationships within our family and our siblings. And obviously, if you're all born in the same family, doesn't mean you're all going to be best friends. That's ridiculous. We're all human beings with our own lives and our own, passions and things like that. And I think that what struck me was you coming to terms and being okay with that, but because I think that we can put pressure on ourselves if we lose a sibling, like, oh my God, I really need to be way closer to my siblings that are still alive. Well, that's just, it's not realistic, right? I mean, we have the relationships that we have, but what you wrote about that really touched me was the small ways for you to stay connected through, words with friends. It was just such a beautiful example that, he's alive on the other end. You have each other's backs. You may not spend long hours talking on the phone together. I'm going to cry, but you'll always be there for each other. And that, I think, is what I want listeners to really hear, that when you lose somebody that you love, a sibling is what we're talking about here. And you don't have to put pressure on yourself that all of a sudden you have to have these different kinds of relationships. It's honoring and acknowledging the relationships that we have. And that, what do I want to say? That we can have these different relationships and let them be what they are. We don't have to make them more than what they are because out of some sense of guilt. I don't know if I'm making any sense. I'm trying to.
You're making perfect sense because I think both, I can't speak for him, but I got the sense that Tommy also wanted to be closer, wanted us to, and I did too. We both absolutely had that impulse. Well, we're what we have left, better make the most of it. And we did try. We really, really did. He tried definitely as much as I did to make us closer, and it wasn't there. We could not force it. And I do think that we've ended up in this place that is much more like, hey, we're going to touch base. We're going to stay connected. You're right. We totally have each other's backs. Like if something really happens where we need each other, we're there. I'm certainly grateful to have him supporting us as parents get older and everything else. So, yes, it's really great to know he's there. And it's also okay that we're not ever probably going to be best friends.
Exactly. Thank you. That was that was much more eloquently put.
Oh, no, you took us there. It's all good.
It's hard to find the words because there is something that happens, death, where we grapple with our humanity and our existence and our relationships. And now all of a sudden we have this deep, deep grief that we're carrying over the person that we lost. And what does that mean for the rest of our relationships, from friendships to
Mm.
relationships within families? Some families blow apart, some families get closer and more tightly bonded. And it really is up to each individual. I can't believe that we're coming. I cannot believe that we've almost been on for an hour. And I want to bring us to, I really don't want to give away the end of the memoir, so I'm going to stay away from the ending.
Okay.
But I'd like to hear from you because I know from a personal experience writing my book, I was constantly trying to keep everybody in my family in mind. How are they going to feel about this? What's going to be, and I think that that's true for anyone writing nonfiction. What was that experience like for you? You said your brother supported it, your mom supported it. It takes courage to put a book out like this. And so I'm just curious what that process was like for you in feeling like it was, I want to say okay, because obviously you could do anything that you wanted, but I just knew through your writing to honor the people in your life was very important. So can you talk to us a little bit about that and what that was like for you?
Yeah, absolutely. I did a reading recently where somebody talked about getting permission and about reviewing the work with family members, and I didn't do that. So even though they knew I was doing the writing, didn't actually ask permission to tell the stories I did, and I didn't run things by them. And the reason I didn't is I just thought it was going to make me censor myself. And I don't think I could have gotten it all out on the page if I had been checking in with them constantly. So even though they theoretically are okay with it, it's a different process than a lot of authors would take when they're writing about family members, because some people feel very strongly that they won't go to print if they've written about someone else without that person giving it the stamp of approval. So to be clear, I didn't ask for that. And that is because I really decided, though it took a lot of deep thinking and some therapy, to decide that the story really did belong to me. And the fact that other people were present was because I'm not living in isolation. These experiences happened with other people. And the really, really key people were my mom and Tommy. And so, of course, they were there. Interestingly, I did run a chapter by my dad because I wanted his take on whether a scene felt authentic. As memoirists, you can't exactly fact check, but you can do like a gut check with somebody to say, I'm trying to replicate something from when I was a tiny kid, and I obviously wasn't taking notes for my forthcoming memoir. So, does this feel true? Does it read to you as like something that would have happened this way? And so there was a little bit of checking that way with the process. But yeah, a couple of chapters ended up being published as standalones, and I did share those with my brother. And so he's in the loop. But I think, again, more than anything, I think both of them are proud of me for doing the work and are pleased that David will live on in some way. And I think that Tommy also shares that unique sibling loss lens, but it might be slightly overblown to say that they were entirely okay with everything. So I just want to be totally honest about
No, and
that.
I love that. That was my experience too. I did the same thing. I ran a few things by my brother because we flew to Hong Kong together and I wanted to make sure it was reading as
Mm,
accurate as possible. But the question, so have Tommy and your mom and your dad read the book yet?
such a good question. My father has, and for those listening, this was my brother's stepfather. So there is that level of
One step kind of
one step removed, right?
removed. Yeah.
Which somehow makes it, I think, just ever so slightly less painful.
Torturous. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, torturous maybe is exactly the right word. My mom and Tommy have advanced copies and they have acknowledged receipt of said copies. That's
Yeah.
what I can tell you about that.
Yeah. It's going to
Which
be,
which is part of why I want to be clear that it's not entirely comfy for everybody. I mean, it's also, as you know, having just read it, it's not exactly a beach read.
no.
So I think, and not everybody wants to spend time looking at grief the way that I did. So I also respect that when going back to thinking about how everyone deals with this differently, my mom and brother certainly deal with it differently, and I respect that. So whether or not they read it, when they read it, how they respond to it is TBD.
That's good because to this day, I know that all of my brothers have not read the book, and it's fine. I didn't expect them to, and one of my brothers could barely get through the first three chapters. So I just said,
Yeah.
and I think that that's a really important piece too, that when you put something out into the world, we really have to let go of who reads it, what
Hmm.
they have to say about it, because especially stories like this, where I could see that your mother wanting to relive any part of that would not be like, "Ooh, I can't wait."
Right.
It's hard. All right.
Exactly.
I end with two. I can't like I am kind of blown away that it's been an hour. So I
Me
before
too.
we wrap up though, I want to ask you, there's gotta be stuff that anything you want to talk about that I haven't asked you. Is there, something
Gosh, I don't know. You've been very thorough. Covered a lot of the really, really important pieces in the book conceptually without giving anything away or not giving much away. I don't think so.
okay. How
I
did
could talk to you forever about this for sure, especially because you and I have so many unique parallels. It's really amazing.
It really is kind of amazing. I was a little blown away when I was reading. I want to ask you, though, before I get to my last two questions, how long did it take you how long did you work on this book from
It's
beginning to end?
That's a messy question too, because of course it wasn't exactly in a straight line. The first draft was my graduate thesis, and it was probably, 60 to 70% of what you hold in your hands now if you have the book. So there a lot of content was actually produced in my MFA, which was great. But then when I graduated, I had to take a break. I think not only because grad school was so intense, but because the story was so intense. And I teach writing through loss programs, and I talk to people about you're probably going to need to take breaks if you do this kind of work. It's very emotional. It's hard stuff. So I had to take a serious break after I graduated, and then I was very happy to be selected for a writing retreat where I had 5 days alone in a cabin in the woods, and I finished the book then. But it really did take a while. Like if I think about it honestly, there were fragments of it before grad school, then there was after grad school, and I think all told, if I do the math, because I had to do this in another interview recently, I ended up with about 4 years of work, which is pretty long, but it's partly the subject material. It was partly that it was my first book and I had no idea what I was doing. And partly just that I've always had to also work full time and I was married at the time. I had all the life stuff that other people have too. So it definitely took a while. And then it took a while to land with my publisher. And so it was a very, very long journey to publication, which is why I'm just so tickled it's finally reaching fruition.
So happy for you too.
Thanks, Susan.
I can't wait for this book to get out into the world. I
Oh,
have just delighted in this conversation. I knew I would. I really couldn't wait. I want to ask you, though, I always close with two questions
okay.
because obviously it comes from personal experience. But I think that, you know, the way that we think about self-love can change significantly after a deep loss and after really delving deeply into the grief and loss process as you did. So my question is, what does self-love look like for you now?
I think self-love means for me taking care of my body. Yoga is one of my favorite ways to do that. Writing is certainly a huge way I care for myself. I can't overestimate how much processing I do on the page for all kinds of things, not just grief. And that means a great deal to taking care of my own sense of well being. And friends. Friends are gold. I would be nowhere without them, absolutely nowhere. And I treasure them beyond anything else in this world.
I love that. Okay, finish this sentence for me. Hope is.
Oh, I wasn't ready for that. Hope is belief in the future.
Okay, well, with that, we are going to wrap up. And I want to thank you for this beautiful interview, for this beautiful memoir that you're putting out into the world. Why don't you let us know where people can find you?
Sure, I'm online at annpinkertonwriter.com.
And do you have an Instagram account?
Do. It is Ann Pinkerton Writer.
Look at that. All right. And we will have your channels. We'll have all of your links in the show notes. And I want to thank all of my listeners for tuning in. I love you guys. And we'll see you here again next week. Bye for now.